Chapter 2, 1967. San Francisco, the Priest. I first saw San Francisco from above. Not a skyscraper city, nor a web of threaded freeways, but an open-faced picnic city spread on stuffed green hills. Thick picnic houses and frosted gingerbread houses neatly stacked on the heaping hills. Downtown was a surreal, wavering chessboard of colorful blocks and classy specialty shops up and down steep slopes, tracked by click-clacking, ratchet-catching, chug-chugging, pull-pulling, tug-of-war with gravity cable cars ringing their arrival. And in the day distance, from the hills you could see the chocolate factory on the wharf, the salt bay gleaming blue, the specks of colorful boats, and the deep orange, larger than I thought, Golden Gate Bridge. On foggy mornings, it was a sedate city of Victorian houses that had not yet opened their eyes. Long drip nets of mist still floating at their windows. But on clear mornings, crisp winds gusted scents to thrill your senses. I bet there wasn't a city in the world like it. Besides the open cable cars and the panoramic views from humongous hills, besides at least 7 ethnically distinct neighborhoods natural to the city since the rest of the world came to port, Mission and Fort, with their garlic, fresh mint, olive oils, cayenne, curries, and soy sauces. Besides the migratory flocks of long-necked tourists in ice cream parlors and Red Dragon restaurants, and the remnants of non-conforming North Beach beatniks in their musty bookstores and galleries smelling of linseed oil, paint, clay, and leather. Besides all of that was the Haight-Ashbury district, a crossroad around which were gathered the new beat, new hip, less proud, less isolated young hipsters, the hippies, a whole new culture. We entered the Haight through heavy traffic and throngs of people in vintage costumes customized for comfort. It was a time and place of unbound hair and bralessness. New in fashion were low-waisted, snug-fitting, bell-bottomed jeans that swayed at the feet, making a slender body look willowy. Music trickled and gushed from windows. Kids ran through crowds and never seemed lost. And everywhere, the words of love and peace were unabashedly aired, along with earnest belief in the ideals that went with them. Mary knew a Catholic nun through whom we met an Irish-American priest who had just loosened his collar and let his hair grow for Christ. All of the years that I had been taught to revere the Catholic fathers put them at a distance from me and other mortals. Father Mike was young and bearded. He was smoking a joint. I could barely believe it. Before going out the door with his briefcase, Mike welcomed us to stay in the 3-bedroom Haight-Ashbury apartment he co-rented with a theatrical homosexual and a hefty red-haired woman, both of whom worked during the day. Charlie recalled that when he had first arrived in the city without friends or money, a 16-year-old had called him brother, given him a blanket, and introduced him to the Diggers, a group of unestablished philanthropists providing free food and clothing. He thought highly of the Diggers and went out to see them. I walked around the windy flat, awaiting my turn in a clawfoot bathtub, and through the bay windows watched a lively stream of people on the sidewalks below. When Charlie returned, we buoyed ourselves with cannabis and bobbed the main stream to Golden Gate Park, where paths narrowed and people meshed, spilling over the bright grass in the clearings. The air was spicy with oils and smoke, the spirit high. It spread through the gratefully live musicians and laughing dancers, bands of merry men and barefoot maidens, childbearing family circles, curious observers, veterans, and vagabonds. Absent were hot dog and beer vendors, and money was not an issue. A day in the park was a utopian dream, but at the end of the day, we were happy to have a place to stretch out our sleeping gear. Father Mike and Charlie talked into the night about world changes as reefer smoke curled between them. Mike seemed gleefully free of church constraints, yet eager to air his personal theology. I fell asleep listening to the odd harmonies of Jefferson Airplane. I was reading Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse about Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. Like Mike, I'd been raised in Roman Catholicism, but Buddhist practices of meditation and spiritual union with nature seemed more Christ-like to me than the rush of material production/consumption that Western life had become. Eastern beliefs in karma and reincarnation were common in hippie communities, loosely meaning a kind of universal report card and progression via rebirth, whether in this life or in a series of lifetimes. With these ideas and a rejection of anything establishment, conventional employment was dismissed. Bartering became part of the new Renaissance, an active trade in wood and metal crafts, cotton clothing, raw wool and yarn, organic vegetables, marijuana, and LSD. The outcome would theoretically be a cleaner, more conscious, less violent world in communion with natural life. The underground brotherhood of love was even more invested in the transformation, distributing LSD as a sacrament to as many as could be reached. The Beatles confirmed for me the correctness of our direction, musically tying all the tie-dyes and God's eyes in a philosophical whole. They were nothing short of a phenomenon. Charlie told Mike that while in prison, he thought they were just another teeny bopper fad. But after listening to their words, he understood what the kids are talking about. We would travel between San Francisco and Mendocino countless times, and on each visit, Mike and Charlie exchanged supplies and information. On one trip, Charlie ran into the two ex-cons he'd met at McNeil Island, one of whom had taught himself to knit and sold sweaters as part of his living. He was short, stout, had very white teeth, and smiled a lot. The other had a handgun. Charlie told us he had to take care of something and left with them for Berkeley, where they were staying. On his return, he told us that the short one would be back the following day, and that, by the way, he had talked them into giving him the gun and had tossed it off the Bay Bridge. In Mike's communal kitchen, we had to reassure the chubby, red-haired tenant that we were not eating her food. Standing by the toaster, impatient to talk, she complained, it sounded more like boasting, that her parents would just die if they saw her with her new boyfriend, Earl. I didn't think anything of it, but Charlie later commented that this woman's parents had programmed her in reverse, creating long-standing conflict with her, and then expressing their abhorrence for interracial relationships. When, on Haight Street, a young black woman engaged Charlie in flirtatious banter, I didn't understand what he said to her, but it made her laugh, and I felt a sense of pride that she was interested in him. Then I heard him say, "I see you, woman, but I'm not your man." As we got into our car, I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "I see her beauty, but I'm not her man. Her man is black like she is." Simple. It wasn't simple to me. It was racist. My parents had never said anything to me about race. They generally followed major sympathies or said nothing at all. I had gathered my opinions from books and movies, seen racially diverse talents in Hollywood, and listened to Bob Dylan and Joan Baez records. Black suffering at the hands of white oppressors was one of the dialogues of the decade. Across the bay, the college at Berkeley was a boiling pot of pooled outrage against war and racial discrimination. I asked Charlie, "Are you prejudiced?" He countered, "What do you mean?" "Do you see black people as equal?" He eyed me skeptically. "Equal to what?" "To white people," I said angrily. He shook his head slowly and said, "Don't you like yourself?" "It's not that I dislike black people. I like myself. I accepted what I am a long time ago. I wasn't sure what he was, or if I liked it at all." He said, "I grew up shooting dice with the black brothers in the joint. Lived with them at the bottom all my life. Some were like fathers to me. But that don't make me one of them. I knew it just as much as they did. I'm white, they're black. We're different." I couldn't believe he thought this. I was a quiet champion of the poor and oppressed, and prepared to feel sorry for his life in prison. But progressive people everywhere shunned even the word difference. I asked, "Well, do you think you're better than black people?" He said, "Who's to compare? There's a beautiful tiger with stripes, a leopard with spots, and a lion with a mane. They're all cats, but they're different. Not better or worse, just different." That sounded right to me, but I didn't like it. I said, These aren't cats. They're people. He said, to deny differences is to deny life and nature, and that's a lie. I saw two little boys walking arm in arm, one black, one white. Charlie noticed and told me that those kids didn't realize what was pushing them. I didn't care what was pushing them. I was comforted by the sight of their contrasting colors. Black Americans had suffered, and we had to make it up to them. They were ready to take vengeance to the streets. Only 2 years before, LA ghetto dwellers had burned down their own neighborhoods. Charlie said, "Look, I have Mexican tattoos on my arms. I speak some Spanish and I learn the Mexican songs. But I'm white. I'm what they call a patty, from a white mama and a white daddy." He smiled, and then he became serious. "That's up front. We were up front about it, and there's respect in that. It's your nice society that looks down on people. It's you who look down on them to think that they would want to be like you. The real black man don't want to be like anybody but himself. And then the word equal is silly, isn't it? Does the tiger say to the lion, 'I want to be equal'? No. To him, there was no question of equal or not equal. He just is, and he serves life." He paused. "There is an order," he said. "Better or worse, up, down, back, forth, got nothing to do with it. What people think does not even enter into the natural order." He was quiet for a moment. Finally, he said, "It's your society that looks down on people and wants to help them into the misery, and the lack of love that drives all you kids away from home. You, yourself." I let the question about races rest. I had to admit that with all I'd had in society, and all I'd learned, I was unhappy and confused. And it was true that I didn't want to spread my unhappiness to anyone else. The scene near the university in Berkeley was almost military. The marchers dressed mostly in surplus khakis and army greens. American flags were on display, sewn on one guy's butt, upside down on another's jacket. In Charlie's view, the emblems spoke loudest, and though the speaker said, "Down with U.S. foreign policy," the symbols said, "Down with the U.S., down with America." He said it was like downing ourselves. On Telegraph Avenue by the university, activists distributed political pamphlets. Black Panthers were selling Chinese Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. It did seem like half the world was going communist. I didn't feel qualified to hold an opinion. Having few facts about communism to work with, I was either too dumb to understand, or our teachers and leaders hadn't adequately illustrated the pros and cons. By then, I distrusted their opinions. Communist governments' motives were equally suspicious. But worldwide communists verbally sided with capitalism's poor and oppressed, an increasingly popular position amongst young people Any difference between courage of conviction and criminal conviction was blurred. All prisoners were oppressed, and therefore not only accepted, but favored. Established institutions and material wealth were out, poverty in. Suddenly, it was popular to be ill-born and low down. People of no class had real credentials. In fact, if you hadn't lived a hard life, you might want to lean on, borrow, or steal the life of someone who had. The Black Panthers and Black Muslims rallied on behalf of Black people with a capital B, incidentally raising white fear and guilt. They intoned hurt and anger few white kids had known, and it was commonly said that white people have no soul. Charlie said, "No person, race, or religion owns soul. People may reflect it, but when you hook up, the soul has you. You don't have it." I was fascinated with Charlie's perceptions. Before putting on my skate key, he wore no jewelry of any kind. On meeting a burly stranger with a penchant for ornamental chains, he asked, "Who's got you all locked up, man?" Catching his meaning, the man said he didn't know why he liked chains. But Charlie later speculated that the chains were part of some woman's thought. His feelings about women seemed conflicted. He had said that he intended to visit his mother up north, but he never called her and showed no hurry in getting there. He had also told me that in Haight-Ashbury he was called the gardener, but when I mentioned it earlier, he chuckled puckishly and confessed that it was just a pickup line. Before we left the city, Charlie stopped to talk to a man who was fixing a car. He said, "I once knew a man who went to work to buy a car so that he could get to work and make enough money for gas and car payments." The man with grease on his nose laughed and said, "Yeah, that's me." Charlie said, "Me? I'm gonna go look at the redwoods." A century before, the entrepreneurial Henry Meigs left San Francisco for refuge in South America. The errant creator of San Francisco's Philharmonic, Fisherman's Wharf, and a sawmill in Mendocino took his wife, children, servant girls, and a plentiful stock of fine wines to Chile, where he laid down business and political tracks until contracted by the Chilean government to build a railroad. With his success, the government of Peru requested his services for construction of 2 railroads over the Andes Mountains, resulting in hundreds of miles of track built on millions of California redwood ties shipped from Mendocino. At a train station in Lima, a bust of Meigs was erected with a plaque that translated, "Don Enrique Meigs, Railroad King of the Andes." As with most of history's wealthy and accomplished lawbreakers, public opinion couldn't decide whether to scorn or praise Meigs. Before he died in Peru, the California legislature voted to completely absolve him for theft of San Francisco city funds. In a forest north of the city, we got out of the car and stood in the stillness. I wondered if his mother lived near. "She does live near," he said. Then a ghostly reverence for this forest came over me, raising the hair on my skin, and his voice was firm, as if I should have already known. He said, "You're standing on her." Mendocino was fragrant in new life and decay. Odd, prickly creatures bubbled in tide pools below waterlogged sod, wildflowers, and grasses. Apart from the strange afternoon fog, days were warmer, especially inland where woodlands enclosed sunny hills and meadows. We tripped. Charlie's hair had grown down around his ears. A clean, burnished brown, it never seemed out of place. He had a trim goatee and often wore, without a shirt, a white sheepskin vest Father Mike had given him. It exposed his tattooed arms and a T-shape of chest hair that tapered to his navel. One day, Mary came laughing with 2 white seashells that looked exactly like nubs of goat horns when placed high on the sides of his forehead. He allowed us to glue them on, but then insisted on twirling flower sprigs in our hair and stripping us nearly bare. Grabbing Mary's flute, he played a few rough notes, to which his eyebrows did a dance, and commenced to chasing us around the woods, giving random campers a glimpse of who. People came to investigate, and we sneaked back home. Charlie entertained with imitations, parodies, and characters he seemed to pull from creation. He could turn a rag into something classy and use anything for a prop. His humor was based in truth, recognition of which, paradoxically, sometimes came as a surprise to him. Mary and I were reluctant to participate in even some of our own schemes, but he enjoyed himself without fear, and sometimes without us. By a hillside farm where sheep grazed, he stopped the car and said he would be back. He picked up a tall walking stick on the dirt road to the farmhouse and talked with the farmer for 10 or 15 minutes before he returned, chuckling to himself. All he said as he started the car was, "Man says they don't hire shepherds anymore." From rock grottos to forest cathedrals, the northern coast is luxury to my memory. On the beach, Charlie sang, "You must give to find love," with a tinge of tango and a mood shift from minor to major chords, somber to joyful, very cool. His voice grew in volume rather than loudness, and within the volume were dimensions in vibration. He was intensely handsome to me at these times, like a classical actor in an understated role. It wasn't the presence of seriousness so much as the absence of frivolity and everything else. It was the crashing of the incoming tide, the melting sun, and such feeling in his voice that it made me shiver. He made love in the same way, and although I couldn't entirely accept it, his sensuality communicated. The Mendocino summer turned us beautiful colors. On a walk through the woods, Mary and I stopped by a friend's cabin and we were amused to find the latest fashion magazines advertising cosmetics to make you look like you just walked out of the woods. The natural look was definitely in. I felt natural. For the first time in my adult life, laughter welled from deep inside me rather than politely from my throat. And I became so interested in the world around me that I forgot to doubt myself. Then I remembered. We took trips for supplies and for change. Mary and I did change, touching newness and retreating to the familiar discontent. It seemed that the happier we got, the more miserable we were on the rebound. It occurred to Charlie that we, and much of the world, were at war with ourselves. Little by little, he conveyed his dawning notion that he was trapped. He couldn't be at peace until we were at peace. One day, we heard him singing to himself. Got a skate key on my neck. Got $1 million in my shoes. Ain't got time to sing the blues. When Charlie got depressed, Mary and I felt a little better. When he muttered, I just want to be a dirt farmer. Or maybe I'll be a truck driver. We smiled at each other. These childlike inclinations to be whatever and whoever he saw on the highways endeared him to us. In fear that he might actually go, we came around to a full recovery. Charlie was changing too. There were times at night while he was driving that he stared at the blacktop as though hypnotized by it. Not bug-eyed or weird, just serious and straight ahead in a very relaxed manner. And he talked. Some of what he said was beyond my understanding, but there were two distinct voices. One of them was wiser, the one that did the telling. The other was his ordinary voice, asking things he sincerely wanted to know. Sometimes the things he learned in these conversations made him line up and turn to us to see if we had heard. At other times, he drew into himself and was solemn for a long time. I would attribute the advent of these dialogues to extended stays and a stark form of solitary confinement that may no longer exist in American prisons. He describes it as follows. In solitary confinement, it is dark. There is nothing but a cement floor and you. In darkness, there are no bounds. Am I up from the floor or down from the ceiling? Am I right or left? Of what? It's all relative. And if I could conceive of a question, surely I could conceive of the answer. When Charlie was new to San Francisco, someone had introduced him to a strong dose of LSD. He remembered it laughing. They took me to the Fillmore, and I turned inside out. I became all the people dancing under the strobe lights, and I panicked. I ran outside, and I was everyone on the streets. I tried to get away. I didn't want to see it, but I couldn't get away from it. Later, he said, lay on a beach and laughed with Timothy Leary, thinking that, as crazy as it seemed, in this fast and pharmaceutical age, It made perfect sense for spiritual transcendence to come in a pill. The LSD in San Francisco was rumored to have been created by a renowned yet mysterious man named Owsley, a philanthropic genius. But Father Mike warned that the street market had been polluted with harsh varieties containing other drugs, and there was no way for a novice to know the difference. Mike was a reasonable constant in an anything-goes atmosphere. Each day he went to work with his briefcase, and each evening he and Charlie talked. Their conversations were sometimes debates, peppered with Charlie's old cleverisms and Mike's cliches and pedantry. Mike offered. By the same token, Charlie dismissed with, "And you can get on the cable car." They laughed at being from such diverse backgrounds, discussing the world's opening mind. Mike's house on Cole Street branched off of Haight Street, and Haight was the place to be. It led to Golden Gate Park and to people from all over the country. At least half of all residents and travelers were barefoot. I cut my foot on a broken bottle, and Charlie insisted on carrying me home. I was a bell-bottomed newcomer, but plenty of hippies wore wild flourishes and beads, paint, and feathers. Tie-dyeing had just made a splash, and clothes were made to trip on. Tripping was not falling down, but waking up and enjoying the view. Marijuana was plentiful and inexpensive. It slowed the minds of our generation enough to realize that we were getting old way too fast, collecting worries instead of experiences. The consciousness it raised called for comfort. The caress of soft materials could be sensual, and early forms of polyester felt exactly like what they were: plastic. Breasts of all sizes bobbled beneath thin materials, and, with exceptions, the effect was more natural than vulgar. On the other hand, not everyone shared sensibilities. Some street people doused their clothes with patchouli oil, as if to eliminate the need for washing. And today, I can't smell patchouli without thinking of sordid sweat. Behavior ran the gamut from creative to crass. But the majority of hippies were joyful, considerate beings. I heard Charlie tell someone that a true hippie would give you his shoes if you needed them, and be standing on the side of the highway playing his guitar with a smile on his face. I knew he had done it. I saw in his face the long open road, highlighted by extraordinary experiences, and a little longing. Mary and I were like luggage he had to carry and store. Yet we'd do something simple, like find his socks, and he'd say, "What would I do without yous?" Charlie had a limited pass to travel. He was required to mail in a monthly written report to his parole officer. Mary always took care of the forms. He was supposed to be looking for a job, but he was a musician. Anyone who heard him sing and play the guitar would agree. And he did play and sing for people who gave him money, like Mary and I, for instance. Roger Smith was a decent federal parole officer, both professionally and personally. Charlie took us to see him. Blonde, brawny, and educated, he had a pert wife and a 22-foot sailboat. He offered to take us sailing in that sometime, commonly understood as never, but he liked the three of us, and he had no reason to believe that Charlie would ever do or be anything other than what Mary and I and his talent allowed. Soon, we were traveling the length of the state,